Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast welcomes Jack Cashill, Ph.D., an independent writer and producer, author of the new book, Ashli, The Untold Story of the Women of January 6th. And Jack Cashill, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, sir. Always a privilege.
I'd like to talk a little bit about what you do in the beginning of the book, was contrasting the French and American visions and the modern-day Jacobins, because this plays a big part.
What I was looking for was a term that I could use to encapsulate all of those people of various sort of backgrounds who make up the functional left in the United States. Not all of them are leftists, but they're all playing that game. The Jacobins right now, certainly during the first 2 years of Biden's administration, had complete control of virtually every major institution in the United States. I mean, they own Hollywood. They own Silicon Valley. They own Washington, certainly for those years. They own Wall Street now, corporate America now. They're encroaching on the military. Academia, lost cause. Lower ed, same thing. And in the criminal justice system. The net result is that they were dictating policy. And that way, when I talk about what I didn't want to say the Democratic deep state complex or whatever, media Hollywood complex. So I just condensed it down to the Jacobins, who in 1789 emerged as the most radical wing of the French National Assembly. They enlisted in their ranks some, entrepreneurs and other elites, and they ruled Paris for several years in France through their manipulation of the mob, which our current Jacobins do as well. And it just seemed like a nice metaphor. And then, of course, the Jacobins realized that the mob rule can end in pretty disastrous ways, as Mr. Robespierre sacrificed his head to revolution, and others did as well. And it finally resulted in finding a strong man to pull the nation out of anarchy. And that could happen any place where this happens.
You make a point about understanding Trump's female supporters, and I think it's an important point because a lot of times people will categorize them in some way that's not accurate. So what was that point that you wanted to make about what they are and what they are not?
I chose 10 women, almost at random. I mean, I was going to choose both Ashli Babbitt and Roseanne Boylan because they were killed that day. But the other 8 women, I had no information on going into this at all. And what I found, and this kind of surprised me, I had no reason to believe this would be true, is that all of them had kind of rough lives or rough upbringings. Many of them had been divorced or, been through bad relationships, had children out of wedlock. It dawned on me that when the Access Hollywood tape dropped in August of 2016, and the Democrats thought the election was over, so did the rhinos. They were urging Trump to get out, just like they're urging Biden to get out today. Trump said no, because he understood his female base better than the pollsters did, and better, certainly, than the rhinos did. The rhinos aren't married to these women, and they're tougher. They've seen a lot. They're women who listen to country western music and know what DIVORCE means, and know what depression means and hard times means. They know the men misbehave, but they love them nonetheless. So they hung in. They were not deterred by that at all, and that's what shocked their more genteel sisters.
As we look at January 6th in rearview mirror, let's recall for people what it was billed as. I think a lot of people, based on their media consumption, believe it was billed as an insurrection from the very beginning. But what was it supposed to be?
Well, it was called the Save America Rally, and it was organized by a mother and daughter team, Kramer's. And basically, it was designed to be that last final protest. Like corporate Republicans had to buy the line that the election was free and fair, or otherwise be denounced for, subscribing to the big lie. These people knew better. They didn't have to lie to anyone. They had no corporate overseers. They were free to express themselves. And they came to Washington, some of them just stand up for free speech and constitutional rights and the rule of law. Others because they were Trump fans and wanted to see him speak as president for the last time. And there was a shared camaraderie among them all that they found entirely exhilarating and they did not expect. So when they talk about angry crowds, they're not talking about the people who went to the Trump speech. They're talking, these people, to a person, describe it as just a joyful day. Some of them describe it as the best days of their life, the best day of their life, until they end up in prison. And yet of the 10 women I selected, 2 of them were killed that day. And of the remaining 8, 6 have been to jail or are in jail, and 2 await sentence.
The term insurrection has been used over and over and over again, and I certainly refute it whenever I can in my own capacity. But I'd love for you to get on that term and why it is not the correct term and not even close.
Well, because as Ashli Babbitt's mother, Mickey Woodhoff, told me, she goes, the gun-toting population showed up in Washington without their guns. That's not an insurrection, I mean, that's the bottom line on that one. I would say 80-90% of the people in Washington that day probably had guns at home. And many of them had concealed carry permits, et cetera. They all left their guns. I mean, it was remarkably disciplined of them not to bring their guns into D.C., which is a zone in which only criminals are allowed to have guns. That's number one. But the real thing that undoes even the Jack Smith indictment and the January 6th committee, and they overlooked this, they pretend it didn't happen, is that Trump began his speech on the ellipse, which is like sometimes called the White House lawn, at noon. He was supposed to begin at 11 a.m., but for some reason he started at noon, which meant that, and I think there's a conspiracy afoot here, was thrown off. Because when, for instance, Ray Epps and his crew first breached the outer perimeter of the Capitol, it's 12:53 p.m. Trump is still speaking on the ellipse. It's a 45-minute walk away. So in other words, the people who incited the riot or who were at the forefront of the riot, or people like Ray Epps who claim to have orchestrated it, and to some degree I'm sure he didn't go to Trump's speech. So when Jack Smith cites his comment, he said, fight like hell, you got to fight like hell. Well, he said that. Trump said that at 1:10 p.m. At 1:06 p.m., the Capitol Police started lobbing indiscriminately and recklessly tear gas and flashbangs into a peaceful crowd gathered at the front on the west side of the Capitol. That's what pissed everyone off. That's what stirred up the ranks. The notion that was an insurrection, and they'd say, well, they were armed. They weren't armed with guns, but they were armed with flagpoles and pepper spray. Well, there are a lot of people who brought pepper spray because the last 2 rallies in Washington, they had been attacked by Antifa. So some of them wore tactical vests for that reason. One of the women I covered wore a tactical vest just for that reason. She wore it the night before when she and her son went out, to get dinner in Washington. And Washington probably pays to wear a tactical vest and have pepper spray with you all the time, just even on a normal day. So, yeah, that was, you don't start an insurrection without any plans and without any guns. That doesn't happen.
When they talk about Trump's words, they often don't reference that he called for the protest to be peaceful. And I don't have the exact words in front of me, but that's a pretty convenient exception to what actually happened.
And in fact, it's criminally negligent, both in the House J6 committee final report, 800 pages, and in the Jack Smith indictment. They leave out Trump's plea. He goes, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm a little closer than yours, to let's march out of the Capitol peacefully and patriotically, right? Those are the key words, peacefully and patriotic, and let our voices be heard. This is pure First Amendment, right of assembly, right of speech. They omitted that from the indictments, and they omitted it from the final report. It's like, it's sort of like, if in court, that's a Brady violation. You can't withhold evidence because it's inconvenient. But what they do include is his final remarks. You got to go fight like hell, And he's talking metaphorically, but he's saying this 15 minutes after the riot started, 45 minutes away. The people who listened to his speech didn't get to the Capitol until after 2 o'clock. And by that time, everything was sort of well underway.
There's been recent discussion of Nancy Pelosi being at fault for the lack of Capitol Police there and other mispreparation. What do we know about that?
Well, we know a fair amount, and she was captured on video, shot by her daughter for this convenient documentary they were filming that day. And she's basically saying, I effed up, and she did. I mean, that's her responsibility. It falls to the sergeant at arms who reports to the Speaker of the House to defend the Capitol, protect the Capitol. They were over, and that caught her in an odd moment because I had to reconsider my feelings about Pelosi's role. When I saw that video, she was genuinely panicked and upset. She did not realize yet the public relations value of having the media spin this the way of that would favor her side of this debate. So she was, where's the National Guard? Why don't we have National Guard? Well, that's an excellent question. And the real culprits here are the military, the Pentagon. You know, Trump had asked for 10,000 National Guardsmen. He wanted the Guardsmen to protect his people from Antifa, who had caused ruckus at the November and December Trump rallies in Washington. But they were that request was denied. And he's not responsible for the Capitol. That's not his job. It very specifically goes to the House leadership. And the Capitol Police Chief called early on. He said, hey, we need help. They just sat on it for a while. They slow-walked it, both in the House and even worse at the Pentagon. The Pentagon should have known. They should have been prepared. And you had guys like Milley there and stuff who were actively working against Trump's interests.
There was something also very strange, Jack Cashill, and that was the videos I saw, multiple of them, where the police were throwing doors open and seemingly welcoming protesters into the Capitol building. Was that considered in the review by the committee?
No, not really. Nor was it where it shows up most prominently is in the various criminal cases against the J6 defendants. And judge after judge rules that that's irrelevant. Who opened the doors or how they came into the building. That, you know, most of the people just walked in through open doors. Several of the doors were open from inside. There's some dispute as to who and how these doors were open. It could have been, you know, protesters coming in from the other side of the building, from the west side. There were windows broken on the west side of the Capitol sometime after, a little after 2 o'clock. And the people entered through the windows, including Ashli Babbitt. For the most part, most of the people on the east side, and several of the women that I profile, were just swept in against their will because the crowds were surging, and some people were pushing these crowds from behind. And we know that there were some undercover agents doing the pushing. And once you begin to push, and this would cost at least one life, that is Roseanne Boylan. Once like a woman, like Ashli Babbitt weighs 110 pounds. You know, she's in a crowd of men, largely mostly men. She has no sway over the direction of her being. You know, she's just going where the crowd is going.
You mentioned Ray Epps, and you mentioned these agitators and provocateurs. Do we have any sense of how many there were and who actually planted or arranged for them?
No, they remain entirely evasive about this. We know that virtually every agency in Washington had undercover agents in that crowd. This includes the Metropolitan Police, we know, Capitol Police, we know, FBI, we know. As I point out in the book, I believe the Democratic National Party had provocateurs in the crowd as well. And then there were freelance provocateurs that got caught. Because when a freelancer gets caught, he goes to prison. When someone who's protected gets caught, like Ray Epps, he gets treated like an endangered species. So there were various entities with their finger in this pie, all of them seemingly having as a goal to create the kind of pandemonium that would discredit the president and his followers. And they succeeded. The FBI has been almost criminally reticent about sharing information. You know, if they didn't have anything to hide, you know, why not share it? But Ray has admitted, basically, that they had people in the crowd. What they did, at least a couple of Capitol police officers were Metropolitan police officers, Washington, D.C. police officers, were reprimanded for being too provocative, at least getting caught being too provocative. But part of the problem, Rob, is we have some of the more obvious window breakers, provocateurs, et cetera, have not been apprehended. And when they're not apprehended and they're that visible, you suspect something's up.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with our guest Jack Cashill and the book Ashli, the Untold Story of the Women of January 6th in just a moment.
Online at shillingshow.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Community-supported investigative journalism. Schilling Show Unleashed.
We continue now with Jack Cashill. The new book is Ashli, the Untold Story of the Women of January 6th. Let's talk about Ashli Babbitt. People have this picture of her that was put out into the media, but they really don't know what her background was and her fascinating political awakening.
Yeah, no, she was like a lot of these women who had taken a red pill in the recent past. Some were lifelong, conservatives, Republicans, but many of them had been activated. That's the word that Ashli's mom used, not radicalized, activated. Mm-hmm. Ashli was a 14-year military veteran, and like many people, she was in the Air Force, are relatively apolitical, don't get involved, don't vote, etc. Although she was an Obama fan. And then she came back to California with her second husband, Aaron Babbitt, opened up a pool supply business, and once she began to operate in the oppressive regulatory environment in California, that's when she began to see things differently. What was interesting about this, Rob, is that every one of these women, and I did not expect this at all, were day one COVID dissidents. Mm-hmm. They were protesting COVID from the beginning. Some of them aggressively enough to get, arrested or citizens arrest or something. And Ashli included. She called the COVID, living in California, where the regulations were bizarre to the point of just disturbed. She called it the control virus, and accurately. And she had a sign on her pool supply door: if you insist on wearing a mask outdoors, there's nothing we can do to help you. So I was, and one of the women I cover, Rebecca Lavrens, who's awaiting sentencing. I went to her trial in March. She is a great-grandmother, right? She was a COVID protester from day one, and she drove by herself from Colorado Springs in the middle of winter, 25-hour drive, to be at the Capitol on January 6th. She went there to pray for the nation. She enters through an open door, prays for 10 minutes, all captured on video, then leaves, and then a couple months later, the FBI show up at her door, knock, knock. You domestic terrorist, you? Time to put the shackles on and come downtown.
We should talk about what happened to Ashli Babbitt ultimately, and also the denial of on-site medical care, which I guess potentially could have saved her life.
Ashli, just to put it in perspective, she had spent her 14 years in the military, virtually all of it as some form of military police. So when she arrives at this narrow corridor that leads to the speaker's lobby, and the speaker's lobby leads to the House floor, there are 3 police officers standing in front of it. And she's the first one there. So she starts joking with them, talking, because she identified with them. In fact, she had been with the thing called the Capitol Guardians, the National Guard troop that should have been called in that day. She would have been there some years earlier. But as she's talking, then a whole crowd comes behind her. In that crowd are at least a couple of provocateurs, known provocateurs. And then and the police are doing nothing. The one guy starts punching out the windows, and Ashli's now yelling at the, and this is all captured on video, and there's eyewitnesses. She's yelling at him, do your effing job, do something, right? You can't let this happen. And then she goes, call for backup. And then the 3 guys, the 3 police officers, Capitol Police, just walk away, leaving the doors unguarded. At that point, one of the guys, his name was Zachary Lamb, he had a criminal record and no known ties to Trump or MAGA, takes a helmet and starts actually now smashing out the windows into this lobby. They're like transit windows, or above about 3 feet off the ground. Ashley's now beside herself. You can see her. She's frustrated beyond belief. The crowd is surging around her. So she grabs Alam's backpack, pulls him backwards, and slugs him in the face, knocks his glasses off. And she's yelling at him, "Stop this," And then I think, and who knows what her exact motive was, but the motive that makes no sense at all is that she wanted to lead an insurrection based on her performance in that lobby for the previous few minutes. The motive that makes most sense is that she wanted to escape the mayhem. And she was afraid of getting crushed by this crowd. And so she jumps into this transom, and without warning, a policeman out of uniform, Lieutenant Michael Byrd, without any kind of stop or I'll shoot, just shoots and kills her in one shot. She falls backwards into back onto the marble floor of the lobby of the corridor, and just so happens there's a protester there who's a doctor, and he begins to tend to her, and then the police pull him off, and so she's left there to bleed out basically until they can find the wherewithal to take her to someplace else. So that's how she died, and she was in many ways a symbol of the kind of woman who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th. Independent. She was exactly what feminists think they want to be. Feisty, independent, free-thinking, her own person, take charge kind of person. Everyone said that about her. And that's why she took charge, or tried to, in that space, and it cost her her life.
To what extent, if any, was Lieutenant Michael Byrd held accountable for this shooting?
Well, to the degree that he gets promoted, for 8 months, Lieutenant Michael Byrd is kept out of public view. Now, the internet sleuths knew that Byrd was black because you see his hand and you kind of see him in profile for a second. But 99% of America not only did not know who Michael Byrd was, so they didn't know his race. Ashli Babbitt is white. So you have an interracial shooting. We know what would have happened had the race had been reversed. We'd still be rioting in Washington. So for 8 months they hide him. They put him up at the Joint Base Andrews in the executive suite with his dog. I don't know why that is a relative variable, but it seems to be. Then when they roll him out 8 months later with this pre-scripted press conference with the amiable Lester Holt, and they say, why did they keep you in hiding? He goes, threats. And then Holt, weighs in. Racist threats? Yes, racist threats. Okay, we've set this up, right? Yeah. I mean, when no one even knows who he is, he's black. And he's getting racist threats. It's pretty impressive on the part of the white supremacist of the MAGA movement.
I'd love to briefly, because you spend some time in the book on this, comparing the George Floyd riots, which were of such greater magnitude, versus J6 and the public treatment, or at least the media treatment of the rioters.
Well, we have a potential president now, having been cheering on the rioters and organizing bail funds. I'm talking about Kamala Harris here. But the real problem, the real differential of it is because these people are committing arson, murder. There was no arson at the Capitol. There was essentially no vandalism other than breaking windows. There was no graffiti. There was no none of the kind of things you associate with a riot. No fires, no flag destruction, statue toppling, or any of that sort of thing. The protesters all across the country, and they did some major damage, including they totally destroyed, burned down, absolutely destroyed, and chased out of the building the Minneapolis police force from one precinct, third precinct. They kept the federal building in Portland under siege for months, a couple $1 million worth of damage there. And none of these people are in prison today. A more precise comparison is what happened to the Kavanaugh protesters who, occupied the building. There were hundreds of them. They got arrested. They were actually, and very specifically, obstructing an official proceeding, which is what the J6s were charged with. That is the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. Several times Mike Pence, again at the center of the storm, has to, shut down the hearing for a minute to clear the building. And they get $30 to $50 fines. I mean, that sticks in the craw of the J6ers. They were getting as many as 5 years in prison for what their liberal counterparts were getting $50 fines for.
Will there ever be accounting for the way the J6 political prisoners have been treated and the lack of due process?
That's a good question. I'm arguing for, and here's the rub, is that D.C. is Trump got 5% of the vote in the District of Columbia. Those juries will never convict anyone aligned against Trump, and they will never acquit anyone aligned with Trump. So every single J6er who went to a jury trial had been convicted. That's 100% conviction rate. That's pretty impressive. They brag about that as though that were like a feature, you know. Yeah. The short answer is no. I would say this, though. The recent Supreme Court ruling of Fisher versus the United States will help a lot of these guys immensely. Whether they can sue for, time in jail on bogus charges, that remains to be seen. But again, all these courts, these cases will go in Washington. That's where it happened. I'm arguing for and this may rub some people like seem a little too soft, but a South Africa-style Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is maybe the best we ever get. You bring all these miscreants before a commission, and you say, "We'll give you amnesty if you tell us the truth. Otherwise, we're going to convict you or try to." Would they know they won't get a conviction in D.C., but they can at least make their life hell for a couple of years. So, and South Africa is hardly a model of anything good today, and no one really expected it to turn out well, but they did manage that transition pretty well from apartheid to, whatever came after apartheid. So the people who were responsible for what were now being seen as crimes were allowed to come forth, confess up, and then they were given an amnesty and then went on their way without criminal record or whatever. But at least they got the record out. The way we're proceeding now, we'll never even get the record out. And that's really disconcerting.
How do things change if Donald Trump is elected again to the presidency?
Everything changes. That's the only hope any of these people have. If he's not elected in 2024, then the media are emboldened once again. The deep state is emboldened. They've won. And then we're moving further and further down the slippery fascist slope that we've been on since Barack Obama was elected in 2008. And with this major circuit breaker with Trump, that's why they hate him. They had everything lined up. Then they had Barack Obama, then they had Hillary for 8 years. They had it all greased. The skids were greased. The country was going to go their way into sort of a corporate fascist state where the elite, the autocracy, would dominate. But Trump just threw the total circuit breaker, totally unexpected. They could have lived with a Romney, but Trump was the kind of guy who was the bull, China shop, and the China shop is trying desperately to put its pieces back together now. And the next 5 months should be fascinating. The next 5 days should be fascinating. You don't know what's going to happen. By the way, in Charlottesville, where you broadcast from there, correct? Yes. Is where, of course, Joe Biden launched the most disingenuous, actually the most dishonest campaign launch in American presidential history, where he I don't know, you're familiar with this, of course, where he said that Trump had said that these were, the neo-Nazis were very fine people. And he continues to repeat that lie, even at the debate, so it's crazy.
Yeah, our local newspaper just ran a story about the Snopes refutation of that claim. Right. And people here in Charlottesville in positions of political power, they're all Democrats, by the way, they're still clinging to the lie.
And, Snopes did that, I'm convinced, to alert the Biden people that people are on to this lie, that too many people know now. So don't make this a debate point, right? But they did anyhow. You're right. There's places like Charlottesville where you don't have to know anything and everyone's going to echo what you say. You're safe for a long time. But I'm enjoying the internecine squabbling now on the left. It's really pretty fascinating, right?
Yeah, if people would like to get a copy of your book, Ashli, The Untold Story of the Women of January 6th, or if they want to follow your work online because you're quite prolific, tell us how we can do that.
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is Cashill.com. To get the book, I would recommend I'd recommend buying it online through either Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And you can, it's available now in all formats, including audio and ebook. Everyone who's reviewed it, except for one or two leftist trolls, has given it 5 stars. It's the best reviewed book I've ever written. I get people who are telling me, Jack, I thought I knew everything about January 6th, but I didn't know any of this stuff. And then it's odd because I'm working now with Dr. Simone Gold, one of the women I talk about in that, and Ashli.
Yes.
And I'm editing her book. And I said, reading your book, I repeat what people tell me. I thought I knew everything about January 6th, but there's always more to learn. So since so much information has been suppressed, this is the perfect opportunity to get the whole story out, including the amazing story of the pipe bombers and the orchestrated 1 o'clock kickoff of this counter-conspiracy.
I certainly hope people educate themselves by reading your book. Jack Cashill, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you for having me, and hello to all my friends in your part of the world.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.